My husband called me useless at our own kitchen table, told me not to come back until I had taken the good half of my family's inheritance from my sister, and then he threw me out of my own house. So I drove to the crumbling motel my father had left me, the one everyone called worthless, and at 2 in the morning, I found a floor safe that hadn't been opened in 6 weeks. Except the brass on that dial was bright from handling. My father had been dead for 6 weeks. Stay with me, because what was in that safe didn't just change my life, it ended theirs. Welcome to Revenge Explanations, the channel for every person who got handed the hard thing, the dying thing, the thing nobody else wanted, and got told it was all they'd ever deserve. If that sounds like your story or someone you love, hit subscribe before this video is over, because today we are going to talk about what happens when the quiet one finally reads the paperwork. Pull up a chair, we're just getting started. My name is Nora Brennan. I'm 35 years old, and for most of those 38 years, I was the kind of woman other people made decisions about. Not cruel decisions, not always, just the small, daily kind. The ones that accumulate like sediment at the bottom of a life, until one morning you wake up and realize you're buried in them. My husband Travis handled the money. My sister Whitney handled the family narrative. My father, my quiet, deliberate, engineer-brained father, handled the ground. I didn't understand that last part until it was almost too late. Let me take you back to February, because that's where this story really starts. Not with the motel, not with the closing table, not with the floor safe and its bright brass dial. It starts with a sheet pan of dried frosting and a phone call at 6 in the morning. I had run Brennan's Bakery for 11 years. 11 years of 4 a.m. start times, flour-dusted aprons, ledger books I kept by hand because I trusted my own numbers more than I trusted software I didn't fully understand. 11 years of birthday cakes and wedding tears, and the particular satisfaction of watching someone take a first bite of something I'd made from nothing. And then my landlord tripled my rent. Not doubled, tripled. With 60 days notice and the kind of smile that told me he'd already signed with someone else. A vape shop. He handed my 11 years to a vape shop, and there was nothing I could do about it because I had never owned the ground my oven stood on. I had baked on borrowed earth my whole career, and I hadn't understood until the moment I lost it what that actually meant. So by the time February came, I was scraping old frosting off sheet pans in my own kitchen, trying to decide what came next, when the phone rang. My mother had suffered a stroke. She was in the hospital. She would not fully recover. Travis was at the bathroom sink with a razor against his jaw when I told him. He set the razor down. He looked at me in the mirror, and the first words out of his mouth, the very first thing the man I had married chose to say, were, "Did your dad get the apartments retitled yet?" I looked at him for a long moment. "They're not even buried, Travis. I'm just saying somebody should think about it." I didn't shake. That was the thing that scared me. My mother was in the hospital, and I was standing perfectly still at the kitchen counter, and I couldn't tell anymore whether the stillness was strength or whether it was the way a thing goes numb before it breaks. Travis sold financing at a car dealership. He closed deals for a living, and he had been closing me the same way for years, gently, incrementally, with the patient confidence of a man who had decided early on that I was the emotional one, the impractical one, the one who needed to be steered. "You're useless with this stuff, Nora," he would say, almost kindly, wiping the foam from his chin. "Let me handle the numbers." For a long time, I had let him. I had been too tired, too busy with the bakery, too tangled in the daily machinery of a marriage and a daughter and a business, to look up and ask what exactly he was handling and how. But I had just watched a landlord I trusted for a decade hand my life's work to a vape shop, and I had learned something sharp and permanent about numbers and the men who promised to manage them. I didn't answer Travis that morning. I put the sheet pan in the sink, and somewhere behind my ribs, a question began to turn. Slow, grinding, patient, that wouldn't stop for weeks. What exactly had my father spent his quiet years building out at that dying motel? My mother passed first, in late February. My father followed her in March, quietly, the way he'd always done everything, the way the last train leaves a small station. No whistle, just gone. The will was read in the upstairs office of Lyle Garrett, a lawyer who had practiced in our town for 40 years, and who kept his face like a man who had heard every family's worst and retained the professional grace not to flinch. His office smelled of old paper, and swamp cooler air. There was one good leather chair. Whitney took it. My sister arrived in cashmere the color of oatmeal, carrying a Starbucks cup like a piece of identification. Whitney grieved the way some women shop, visibly, performatively, with an audience clearly in mind. She pressed tissues to the corner of one dry eye. She made sounds that were almost sighs and almost laughs, depending on what the room seemed to need. Garrett read the will. To our daughter Whitney Brennan, we leave the 3 residential buildings known as the Mesa Verde Lofts in the Sawmill District, furnished, all leases to transfer. Whitney exhaled. It almost sounded like relief. To our daughter Nora Brennan, we leave the Sundowner Motor Court on Old Route 66, including all adjacent land of record, all outbuildings, and all contents therein. The balance of our real property of record, not otherwise devised, the outlying parcels, wherever they lie, we leave to our daughter Nora as well. Whitney pressed her tissue to the corner of one dry eye. A motel for Nora? She said softly, almost to herself. That's so Dad. She said it the way you'd say, of course, when someone hands you the punchline to a joke you've been waiting for. But Garrett looked at me when he cleared his throat, not at her. There's one more item. Your father left a sealed letter addressed to Nora to be given to her whenever she was ready, not before. Whitney's tissue stopped mid-dab. Her chin came up sharply. A letter for Nora? Why? Garrett had been a lawyer in this town for 40 years. He knew which questions were legal and which were simply hungry. He didn't answer. I caught something in the will language and turned it over in my mind. All land of record. I had run a small business long enough to know that lawyers don't waste words, and neither did my father. He had paid by the syllable his whole life. Every sentence he ever spoke had been load-bearing. I folded the papers, slid my father's sealed envelope into my purse, did not open it. Whitney watched me do it. And for the first time in years, maybe in a decade, my sister looked at me the way you look at someone who might be holding something you can't see. Travis had a spreadsheet open before we made it home. He couldn't help it. It was reflexive, like a hunting dog pointing at movement. 3 buildings, 12 units, he said, scrolling. Call it $12,000 a month gross, $140 a year. They aren't ours, Travis. They're Whitney's. And the motel's a teardown, scrap and dirt. 60 grand if the bank's been drinking. He set his phone down like a verdict. This is simple, Nora. You and Whitney swap or she buys you out. You walk into that closing and you don't leave useless. Dad wrote the will, Travis, not Whitney. Your dad wrote what Whitney talked him into. He said it like he'd married into something mildly embarrassing. And then, almost to himself, he added, and we'll need to talk about the bridge financing. I turned. What bridge financing? Nothing. Something I set up. Don't worry about it. There is a particular tone a man uses when he has already finished a sentence without you. I had heard it from my landlord the month before he handed my lease to the vape shop. I didn't let it go this time. I asked twice. He waved it off twice, smiling. And that smile, patient, practiced, faintly pitying, was the second thing that scared me. That night, hanging up his jacket, a folded envelope slid from the inside pocket and landed in my palm before it could reach the floor. The return address was a bank. The line beneath it read, Home Equity Account. I stood in the dark of the closet with it in my hand for a long time. I thought about opening it. Then I put it back exactly where it had been, the way you set down a hot pan, carefully, and remembering precisely where it burned you. It turned on a Friday. Travis came home slightly drunk, not enough to lose control, enough to let the man who actually lived inside him have room to move. Whitney called me, he said. She says you told her you'd think about the swap. Think about it. That's what I said. You don't get to think, Nora. Not anymore. You lost the bakery. You're out of a job. And now your father hands you a pile of weeds while your sister gets income. And you stand there and say you'll think? I set our daughter's school sweater on the dresser. Frankie was 13 and asleep down the hall. Lower your voice. He did. And that told me everything I needed to know. Because a man who can lower his voice on command was never out of control. He was rehearsing. You're useless, Nora, he said. Almost softly. You always were. He let that settle. Then he said the thing he'd come home to say, the way another man might mention the weather on his way out the door. Don't come back until you've taken the apartments back. I did not cry. I did not beg. I packed 2 suitcases, my bakery ledgers, my mother's turquoise ring, Frankie's overnight bag, and my father's sealed envelope, still unopened, in the front pocket of my purse. I drove Frankie to my friend Joanne's and kissed her forehead while she slept. I'm fixing something, baby, I whispered into her hair. I'll be back. She wasn't fooled. At 13, they never are. She was just being kind.
Then I drove east, out of the city, onto Old Route 66, until my headlights caught a crooked neon sign at nearly 10 o'clock at night. Sundowner, half its letters dead, the other half glowing a stubborn turquoise against the desert dark, like an old argument that refused to be finished. And now, before I tell you what I found in that motel, stay with me, because this is where everything changes.
The office door stuck in the frame. The key on the estate ring was worn smooth by 40 years of my father's hand. But the air inside was cold, not stale, cold and clean. And under the dust, there was something else. Cedar, motor oil, the particular cologne my father had worn since I was a girl. Recent. I stood with my hand on the wall switch and tried to understand what I was smelling. I walked to room 9, the one that faced the old cottonwood. The bed was made tight, military corners. A Louisa Moore paperback lay face down on the nightstand, holding its place near page 80. My father's reading glasses sat on top of it, lenses clean, polished. He hadn't been here once. He had been here this month, maybe this week. My father, who had been buried 6 weeks, had been reading a paperback novel in room 9 and setting his glasses on the nightstand like a man who planned to come back. I lay down on top of the bedspread in my coat, and I slept for 4 hours. The first real sleep I'd gotten since the Friday Travis had rehearsed his speech at my daughter's doorway. At 2 in the morning, I woke for water. Through the office window, the desert was black and absolutely still, except for a soft amber glow leaking from beneath the doors of rooms 5 through 8, lights I had not turned on. In rooms I had assumed were empty, I stood completely still for several seconds, doing the math that your body does before your mind catches up. Somebody was out there, somebody who was meant to be there, because the lights were comfortable and low, not urgent, not afraid of being seen. I went back into the office. Behind the front desk, low on the wall, I found it. A pine panel fitted into the paneling with such precision that in full daylight you'd walk past it 100 times and never look twice. Someone had oiled the hinges, not once, regularly, the way you maintain a thing you use. The panel swung open without a sound. Behind it was a steel door set flush into the concrete floor. A combination dial, old, machined, serious. And the brass of that dial, the part your hand touches, the part you wear down with use, was bright. My father had been dead for 6 weeks. I knelt in front of that safe, in the dark, in my coat, and I did not have the combination. And I understood, with a certainty that settled in my chest like ballast, that whatever my father had been protecting, he had locked it where the person who looked hardest would have to earn it first. She let herself in at 7 in the morning with her own key and a caddy of cleaning supplies, moving with the practiced ease of a woman who had done this every day for 19 years. She saw me, stopped, and her eyes filled immediately, the way grief sometimes does when you run into the shape of someone you've been missing. Mr. Brennan said you'd come when it was time. Her name was Dolly Marquez. She had cleaned the rooms at the Sundowner for 19 years, and my father had kept her on long after anyone would have called this place a business. Dolly, I said, the motel is dead. My dad told everyone it was dead. She shook her head slowly and pointed out the window. A production truck sat beside room 6. 2 people in lanyards were crossing the parking lot with coffee cups, moving with the unhurried confidence of people who had been coming to work at this address for a while. He kept 5 through 8 made up year-round, Dolly said. There's a crew. There's been a crew for 2 years. She handed me a ring of brass keys worn warm, and then a torn slip of paper, a phone number, in my father's square, deliberate hand. Eddie Sandoval. Your dad said call him second. Open the safe first. I don't have the combination. Dolly almost smiled through the tears. He kept the combination where he kept everything that mattered. She nodded toward room 9, toward the nightstand where my father's railroad pocket watch lay face up beside the reading glasses. He worked the line 30 years before he bought this place. That man measured the whole world in numbers nobody else thought to write down. She picked up her caddy and went to make the beds in rooms nobody believed had guests. I stood holding a dead man's keys, watching a soft turquoise light leak beneath 4 doors, holding a watch that had been on my father's wrist every day of my childhood. And I understood finally that the dying motel had been a costume. The question was what it was hiding underneath. The woman in the lanyard knocked on the office door an hour later. She was direct and unhurried and kind, the way competent people often are when they don't need to perform anything. Her name was Gail Foss. She was a location manager for an independent film production out of New Mexico. I'm so sorry about your dad, she said. He was good to us. She laid it out plainly. Her production had been leasing rooms 5 through 8 year-round for 2 years. Crew housing. They paid extra to use the neon lot and the cottonwood as a location. $6,200 a month. Your dad never missed, and we never missed. She set 2 folded checks on the counter. He never cashed the last 2. Said he was saving them for whoever opened the office. I picked them up. $12,400, made out to N. Brennan. My father had written my name on money he refused to spend 6 weeks before he died, in a place everyone in my family had called worthless. I had spent a month believing I was the family loser, the one who let her business die, the one who got the crumbling motel while her sister got income-producing towers in the city, and here was a dead motel quietly clearing more in a month than I'd taken home in some seasons at the bakery. "There's one more thing," Gail said, gathering her coffee cup. "The paperwork your father kept in that floor safe. He told me once it's the important part, not us. We're just the rent." She went to go shoot a sunrise. I stood there with 2 uncashed checks in my hand and a brass watch on the nightstand, and I finally understood what Dolly had meant. I didn't need to ask anyone whether I was useful. I needed to open the safe. The back of my father's railroad watch was engraved with a string of numbers I had seen my entire childhood. He had always called it his start date, the day he and my mother were married, the day he started counting everything that mattered. I had assumed it was sentiment. I had never once thought to read it as a combination. I knelt at the floor safe. I turned the dial. The bolt drew back with a sound like a key finding its lock, the precise, final, deeply satisfying sound of something opening for exactly the person it was meant to open for. The top shelf. Cash. Banded by year, neat as a teller's drawer. The film rent he hadn't needed to spend. Below that, a row of green accountant's ledgers, spines labeled in his square hand, 2006 through this year. And on the bottom shelf, a manila folder, 1 word on the tab, in his handwriting, Nora. I sat down on the cold concrete floor. I put my hands flat on my knees until they stopped shaking. A woman who has been called useless enough times learns to rehearse being seen before she allows herself to be seen. So I breathed. Then I lifted the folder. The top document stopped me cold. It was thick, stamped, recorded with the county seal. The heading ran across the top in capital letters. Ground lease. Mesa Verde Lofts, my sister's towers. The buildings the will had handed Whitney like the prize of the family. The buildings Travis had thrown me out of my own house to chase. My father had kept the paperwork for them locked in a safe at a motel everyone called dead. I closed the folder. I did not read ahead. I knew enough to know I wanted a lawyer sitting across from me when I learned the rest. And I knew, with a quiet that felt like the ground leveling under my feet, that I was done going into rooms soft. Joanne had been running her diner since before I started the bakery. She'd divorced her husband in 2017 when he gave her a reason to, and she'd spent the years since doing night school accounting and learning precisely and without drama exactly how long her own silence was worth. I told her everything: the safe, the film rent, the uncashed checks, the ground lease with my sister's towers printed across the top. She didn't gasp. She didn't reach for me. She topped off my coffee cup and asked me the one question nobody had thought to ask me in 19 years. "What do you want, Nora?" I opened my mouth. I closed it. My husband asked me what was for dinner. My daughter asked me to find things. My sister asked me to make her comfortable. Somewhere along the way, my own answer to that question had gotten so buried under everyone else's that I couldn't locate it anymore. It took me a full minute. I want to stop asking permission to be in my own life. Joanne tapped her mug against mine. "That's a list of 1. Good list." She wrote a name on a napkin and slid it across. Sylvia Otto. Real estate and estates. She's the one you call before you say a single word to Whitney. Eddie Sandoval arrived at the motel the next morning in a Ford pickup that had been red when Reagan was president, carrying 2 coffees balanced on the dash and the face of a man who had read 1,000 title reports and was no longer capable of being surprised by them. He'd worked escrow and title for 35 years, and he'd owed my father a favor since long before that. He spread a parcel map across the office counter like a man laying out a meal he'd cooked many times. "How much did your dad tell you about the lofts?" "None of it." "All right, then we start with the dirt." He tapped a rectangle on the map, a parcel in the Sawmill District. "In 2006, your father bought this parcel when it was a gravel yard and a tire pile. Paid cash. Held it." He moved his finger. "In 2016, a developer named Brant Coyle wanted to put up apartments here, but he didn't want to spend his own money buying land. So he came to your dad and they signed a ground lease. 30 years. He let that sit. A ground lease means Coyle's people built the buildings and owned the buildings, but your father kept the land, the dirt underneath. The developer pays the landlord rent for the privilege of building on it. So the lofts Whitney inherited are the leasehold. Eddie picked up his coffee. We'll get to what your sister actually owns, Nora, and what she doesn't. But you should sit down for the rest. We moved to a back booth at Joanne's, where the light was better, and Eddie laid 3 documents on the table, side by side with the precision of a man making an argument. The first was a recorded deed, my name on it. Fee simple title to the land under all 3 Mesa Verde buildings passed through the will, clean and uncontested. This is yours, Eddie said, recorded clean. The second was the ground lease itself, flagged with sticky tabs at 2 clauses. 2 things matter. First, there's a rent reset. Every 10 years, the ground rent readjusts to current market value. They signed in 2016. The reset hits this year. He moved his finger down. Your dad was charging them about $3,000 a month, a 2016 number. The market for that dirt has roughly tripled. A reset could put the new ground rent near $9,500 a month. I did the math. That changes everything for the buildings. If the rent triples, those buildings may stop making money the moment the new number takes effect. He tapped the 3rd sticky tab. Second, the reversion clause. The lease is unsubordinated, which in plain terms means the developer's lender can't reach your land if the buildings default. Your dad set it up so the dirt was protected, no matter what happened up top. He built you a wall, Nora. He just didn't tell you it was there. Then Eddie slid the final item across the table. The sealed envelope from Garrett's office. The one I'd been carrying unopened in my purse for weeks. I think it's time, he said. So I opened my father's letter with a butter knife, because a woman who was weeded 6 weeks does not tear.
His handwriting leaned right even. Small, measured. Nora, I gave Whitney the part that shines. I gave you the part that holds. Don't sell in a hurry. Don't sell to your husband. The land will outlast all of it. Own the ground you stand on. Dad. I read it twice. Then I set it beside the deed with my name on it, and the 2 pages finally looked like the same sentence, the one my father had been writing my whole life without ever saying it out loud. I called Sylvia Otto that same afternoon. She had a voice like a woman who had been telling confident men no for 30 years and kept her kindness intact anyway. I told her about the deed, the lease, the reset, the reversion. I told her about my husband and the home equity envelope he hadn't wanted me to read. Before you do anything, I said, I want a full title search on all 3 buildings, and I want to know about any escrow that's already open. I want to see what's already in motion before I touch a thing. She called me back that same afternoon. Her voice had changed. Nora, there's an open escrow. Your sister has the Mesa Verde lofts under contract to sell. The buyer is a development LLC, Coyles. They're set to close in 19 days. A pause. And to close, they'll need an estoppel certificate signed by the landowner. Who's the landowner of record? You are, she said. And they have no idea. Travis came out to the motel 2 days later. I opened the wooden office door but left the screen latched between us. The tin latch was cheap. Wouldn't have stopped a determined man. It wasn't for him. It was for me, Nora. His voice was the careful, reasonable version. I overreacted Friday. I did. I was stressed. Come home. We'll figure this out together. I waited, because I had longed to wait for the 3rd sentence. It came right on schedule. But we should talk about a fair arrangement. Because legally, there it was. Apologies that arrive with a second ask attached are not apologies. They are invoices. And the tell is almost always the word but, landing somewhere around the 3rd breath. Talk to Sylvia, I said. My attorney. His jaw did this small, tight thing I'd spent 19 years learning to read. You got a lawyer? I got several things. He looked past me into the office, scanning, appraising, the way he looked at a trade-in. And then he said the thing that gave me the last piece I'd been missing. Whitney needs this sale to close, Nora. We all do. There it was again. We. A man who had thrown me out of my house was using the word we about my sister's apartment buildings 2 days after I'd found a home equity envelope in his coat pocket? Good night, Travis. I closed the wooden door gently and turned the deadbolt I'd installed myself that morning. On my knees, with a borrowed tool belt, the first 2 screws crooked, the 3rd driven slow and straight until it seated clean. The tumbler caught with a sound like a small, final thing being decided. I stood in the dark office a long time, fitting his we against the bridge loan against the closing in 19 days, until the shape of it came fully clear. My husband hadn't just been chasing my sister's buildings, he had bet our house on them. When I finally opened the home equity envelope all the way, really opened it, flattened it on the counter, read every line, here is what it said. Travis had pledged the equity in our home, my home, our daughter's home, $180,000 as collateral for a short-term bridge loan backing Coyle's flip. My signature was nowhere on it. He had done it in the space I wasn't watching, and then he had thrown me out, so I would stop watching.
Sylvia's office smelled of good coffee and old paper. She kept a pen in her hand the whole time, like a conductor. "Here's where you stand," she said. "The deed is recorded and clean. You are the ground lessor, the landlord of the dirt. The lease is unsubordinated, which means the developer's lender cannot foreclose on your land if the buildings fail. That is a strong position. Your father built you a wall." She tapped a printout. "The open escrow. A sale of leasehold property cannot close without landlord estoppel and consent. They need your signature, and the title commitment will surface your ownership the moment they pull a current one." She paused. "Here's how they missed it so far.
The deed to you only recorded a few weeks ago as probate cleared. The buyer's original title search still showed your parents' estate. In the rush to close, nobody repulled the commitment until the title company ran its final check." She set the pen down, the sound of a gavel. "You don't have to do anything dramatic, Nora. You just have to be who you are on the record." I signed her engagement letter. I opened a file for legal separation. I asked her to have an accountant build a clean picture of every dollar I had spent. I had spent a month being told I was useless with numbers by a man who had just bet our house on a flip he hadn't bothered to fully read. I intended to answer him in the only language he had ever respected: a balance sheet, 19 days, a closing table, a room full of people who had already decided what I was worth. They were about to find out what ground I was standing on. Thursday morning, I dressed in my good navy dress, the one Travis had once called too plain. I put on my mother's turquoise ring, not for luck, so I would remember whose daughter I was walking into that room. Frankie caught me in the office before I left, watching me fix the ring onto my finger with the serious, measuring look that 13-year-olds reserve for the moments they suspect will matter later. "Are you and Dad getting divorced?" she asked, because 13-year-olds ask until they get the real answer. "I don't know yet," I told her, "but I know this. I am not going to let anyone tell you that you're useless. Not a teacher, not a boy, not your father, not me." She looked at me the way she looks at the weather forecast before a soccer game, processing it, deciding whether to trust it. "Did somebody tell you that?" "Somebody did," I said. I'm done believing him. I drove her to school and arranged for Joanne to pick her up after. On the way into the city, my phone buzzed. "Sylvia, title commitment uploaded. Landowner consent required. Owner listed as TBD. They still don't know it's you." I set the phone in the cup holder and drove the last stretch into Albuquerque with the windows down. Out past the rail yard, a freight train let out one long, low horn, the sound that had threaded through my whole childhood, the sound of my father's old line. He'd walked that track checking the dirt under it for 30 years before he ever bought a motel. I understood now that he never really stopped. He just changed which ground he was inspecting. And he had handed me the last stretch of it, recorded and clean, in a manila folder at the bottom of a safe nobody had bothered to look for. First Mesa Title kept its conference room cold and bright, with new carpet and the flat smell of burnt coffee and institutional significance, the kind of room designed to make everything that happens in it feel irreversible. There were 5 of them when I walked in. Miss Reyes, the escrow officer, at the head of the table, professional, unbothered. A woman doing a Thursday. The buyer's broker with a laptop open. Brant Coyle, for the purchasing LLC. 50 years old, expensively plain. The kind of man who measures people in cells on a spreadsheet. My sister Whitney, in cashmere, holding a Starbucks cup. And beside her, in his closing day blazer, scrolling his phone the way he did when he wanted a room to think he wasn't nervous, Travis. They believed they were there to close a $1.4 million sale. Whitney saw me first. The blood went out of her face by degrees, like a tide pulling back. "Nora, why are you—" "This is a private," Coyle's jaw said. Travis looked up, and for the first time in longer than I could count, my husband looked at the whole of me. Not the wife, not the failed bakery, not the woman he'd put out his own door, the whole of me. And I watched him try to decide, in the space of 2 seconds, what it meant that I was here. Miss Reyes glanced at her file, unbothered. "Before we proceed, we need the ground lessor estoppel certificate. The lease underlying these buildings is unsubordinated, and the sale cannot close without the landowner's consent." She turned a page. "The fee owner of record is listed as," she found the line, "Nora Brennan." The room went the particular kind of quiet that follows a name that lands differently than expected. Whitney turned her head slowly, as if the table itself had said something impolite. Coyle's hand stopped on his pen. The buyer's broker looked up from his laptop for the first time. And Travis's phone went dark in his palm. Every face in that room turned toward the woman they had spent a month calling useless. The one who got handed the crumbling motel. The one who lost her bakery and got told not to come home. And nobody in the room said a word. I set my bag on the table and took my time, because some sentences are better when you don't rush them. I laid 3 things on the table, squared up. the way my father set out tools before a job, the recorded deed, the ground lease, the reset schedule. Then I spoke in the voice I used to read a recipe out loud. At 4 in the morning, flat, precise, sure of every word. I own the land under all 3 buildings. The deed is recorded. Miss Reyes can verify it from here. Miss Reyes nodded. She already had. The lease is unsubordinated. I slid the ground lease to the center of the table, which means the buildings sit on my ground, and the buyer's financing cannot touch that ground. And the lease resets this year. I slid the reset schedule. The current ground rent is approximately $3,000 a month. At the reset, the market figure is roughly $9,500. Once that takes effect, by my math, these buildings stop making money. The buyer's broker had stopped typing. He read the schedule, looked at Coyle, then began, very quietly, to close his laptop. Whitney found her voice. It came out high and long. That's not possible. The apartments are mine. Dad left them to me. The buildings are yours, Whitney, I said. Dad left you the buildings. He left me the ground they're standing on. I let that settle. Then I gave her back her own words, gently, exactly as she'd said them to me across my father's counter, with a tissue in her hand. You told me you did me a favor, taking the motel off the table. The room went still again. Without the landowner's estoppel and consent, Miss Reyes said, folding her hands with the composure of a professional who has seen this exact species of revelation before, and with a reset of this magnitude pending, I am not able to close this transaction today. The buyer's broker said something low and urgent to Coyle's side of the table. Coyle had gone gray, because he understood faster than anyone what tripling the ground rent did to a flip he'd already borrowed against, and was now desperately trying to exit.
And across the table, Travis stood up so fast his chair scraped back. You did this on purpose. His voice was loud now, the daytime mask gone completely, the careful, rehearsed husband burned away in a single second. You set us up. You let us walk in here. After everything? His hands were open at his sides, the way they got before a thing he couldn't take back. I didn't raise my voice. I have never gotten anywhere raising my voice, and I was not going to start in a room full of people who had already decided I was the quiet one. I reached into my bag and set one more document on the table, the copy of the home equity pledge, $180,000. His signature, mine conspicuously absent. You pledged our house to back this flip, I said. My name is not on it. You did it while I wasn't looking, and then you threw me out so I'd stop looking. Travis's mouth worked. Whitney was staring at the pledge document now too, because she hadn't known. She hadn't known how deep her own brother-in-law was in, how far he'd gone. And I watched something shift behind her eyes as she understood that she had been used by the same man who'd been using me, just from a different angle. You called me useless, I said. I kept my voice exactly as quiet and even as his had been on the Friday night he said it to me. And then you told me not to come back until I had taken the apartments back. I let it sit in the room. I didn't take them, Travis. I never needed to. I was already standing on them.
Coyle pushed back from the table. The buyer's side was packing up in earnest. Whitney sat down hard, as if the chair had been pulled out and shoved back into her simultaneously. And Travis looked around that bright, cold room with its new carpet and its burnt coffee smell and understood finally, all at once, that the only person at this table who had been useless with money had been him. He'd bet the house on the shiny thing. I had inherited the dirt and read the lease. I gathered my 3 documents, squared them again, and stood up first. The power in a room moves the second somebody stops asking permission to keep their seat. I could have let the reset hit and watched the buildings drown. It would have been legal. After the kitchen table and the door and the word useless said gently in the dark, part of me wanted to. But my father hadn't held that ground for 20 years to teach me how to drown people. He'd built a foundation, and there is a difference. So I set the last page on the table, the term sheet Sylvia had drafted, and I slid it toward my sister, not toward the buyer, toward Whitney. Here's the road that doesn't end with you ruined. My voice stayed level. You can keep leasing the ground at the reset rate, the new number, out in the open, the way Dad would have put it. Or you can buy the fee from me at an independent appraisal, on a payment plan you can actually carry. What you will not do is sell these buildings out from under our family to a man who already talked your brother-in-law into betting his house. I looked at Coyle when I said it. He was already on his feet. I'm not here to take your buildings, Whitney. I let it land. I'm here so nobody takes mine again. The buyer's broker announced the sale was off. Coyle walked out without shaking a hand, because the flip he'd borrowed against was now a building that didn't cash flow on land he could never reach. And Whitney, my polished, cashmere-wearing, audience-seeking sister, pressed her knuckles to her mouth. For the first time in our lives, I watched her understand that the prize she had fought for had been the trap.
And the thing she had handed me to be rid of had been the inheritance. Travis caught me in the parking lot under the one working light. "Nora, wait, we can fix this." The selling voice, the closing voice, the house, the loan. If you just sign the consent, the closing goes through, the bridge loan gets paid off, and we're clear. All of it goes away. All of it goes away for you, I said. "Nora, come on, this is insane. You actually own the—" He couldn't finish it. He was looking at the whole of me again, and I could tell it cost him, because the whole of me was something he'd spent years deciding not to see. "We'll talk through Sylvia," I said. "Monday." I had no idea about the land. I swear I didn't know. I know you didn't. And I did. You never looked up for the things that mattered. He stood there with his hands open, a man who closed deals for a living, watching the one deal he'd never bothered to read walk away on ground he'd never thought to check. I'm not angry, Travis. I meant it. I'm precise. I got in my car, shut the door gently, and started the engine. A freight train sounded somewhere out past the yard, long and low, the sound of my father's old line, the track he'd walked for 30 years checking the dirt under it. I didn't need the rearview mirror. I drove east toward a neon sign that was, against all sense, mine. By the time I reached the Sundowner, Dolly had switched on the sign for me. The whole turquoise word came up against the desert dark, throwing color across the old cottonwood. And out on the lot, Gail's crew was rolling on a sunset lights and cables, and someone calling soft for quiet. I let myself into the office and set my father's deed and his letter on the counter, side by side. Then I poured coffee from his dented thermos into a chipped Sundowner mug, and I read his words one last time, out loud, to the empty room. "Own the ground you stand on." The separation became a divorce by autumn. I took my name back, Brennan. I kept the motel and the ground under my sister's towers. I used the film rent and the honest lease money to make room 9 into a real home for me and Frankie. New windows, a kitchen that faced east, the cottonwood out the back. Frankie picked the paint colors. Whitney came out to the motel a week after the closing. No cashmere, no audience. She sat at my father's counter and folded her hands like a woman about to testify. "I thought the shiny thing was the safe thing," she said. "I took the lofts because they looked like winning. I gave you the dirt because I thought it was nothing." We went through Sylvia's term sheet line by line. Whitney chose to buy the fee for me at the appraisal, on a payment plan she could carry. Not a gift, not a punishment. A fair number on paper between two sisters who were never going to be close and might, with work, manage to be honest. Before she left, she stopped at the door. "He told you not to come back until you'd taken the apartments back." "He did you?" I thought about it for a real moment. "No, I never came back to that house at all. I came back to ground that was always mine. The dying motel cleared more in a quarter than the bakery had in a good year. And every cent of it landed on ground I owned outright. Dolly still comes every morning. Joanne comes on Thursdays. Eddie comes on Sundays with a bag of sopapillas and a thermos. And we sit on the office porch and watch Gail's crew chase the last light across the mesa. I bake on Saturdays now, in my own kitchen, on ground with my name on the deed. And I teach Frankie how the dough goes slack and then alive under your hands when it's finally ready. How you can feel it without anyone telling you. How you learn to trust the thing you make, instead of waiting for someone to tell you it's good. My father left me a crumbling motel. My husband called it proof I was nothing. My sister called it a burden she'd carried for me out of love. Not one of them ever read the lease. A woman's worth was never the shiny thing somebody handed her to keep her quiet. It's the plain ground under her own 2 feet that she finally stops apologizing for standing on. That's the story.
If this reminded you to check whose name is really on the things you depend on, go do it this week. Pull the deed, read the lease, check the title, and share this video with every woman who ever got handed the crumbling motel and got told it was all she deserved. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.